The elevator hummed its familiar tune as Richard Hayes rose through the 40 floors of his empire. At 52, he owned half the skyline visible through the glass walls of Hayes Corporation. Tonight, like most nights for the past 15 years, he was the last to leave. The building felt hollow after hours, a tomb of marble and steel that echoed his footsteps. He pushed open the heavy door to his corner office, expecting the usual darkness. Instead, he found hell. A child sat crammed inside his supply closet, knees pulled tight to her chest, gnawing on what looked like a moldy sandwich. She couldn't have been older than 7. Her blonde hair hung in greasy tangles, and her clothes, a faded yellow dress 2 sizes too big, were stained with things he didn't want to identify. But it was her eyes that stopped him cold. They held the kind of emptiness he'd only seen in war documentaries. Blood crusted around her left nostril. Fresh bruises marked her collarbone where the oversized dress had slipped. Her bare feet were black with grime, and when she shifted, he caught sight of rope burns around her ankles. She looked up at him and didn't move. Didn't run. Didn't even blink. "Jesus Christ," he whispered. The girl slowly placed the sandwich on the floor beside her, as if she'd been caught stealing. "I'm sorry," she said in a voice barely above a whisper. "I'll go." But she didn't move. She sat there, waiting for him to hit her or scream or do whatever adults did when they found her where she wasn't supposed to be. Her small body was coiled tight, ready to absorb punishment. Richard's hands shook as he pulled out his phone. His first instinct was to call security, then the police, then he stopped. The girl was watching him with those hollow eyes, and something about her stillness made his chest tight. She wasn't just scared. She was broken. "What's your name?" he asked, shoving the phone back in his pocket. "Emma." "Emma what?" "Just Emma. I don't use the other name anymore." The way she said it, like she'd divorced herself from her own identity, made Richard's stomach turn. He knelt down, his expensive suit pulling tight across his shoulders. This close, he could see more damage. Finger-shaped bruises on her upper arms. A healing cut on her temple. Scars on her wrists that looked deliberate. "How did you get in here?" Emma shrugged. "The cleaning lady let me hide in her cart. She said if I stayed quiet and helped her, I could eat the food people throw away." She gestured to the moldy sandwich. "This was from 3 days ago. I saved it. 3 days." Richard's throat constricted. "Where are your parents?" The question hung in the air like smoke. Emma looked down at her hands, small, dirt-stained hands that should have been holding toys or crayons, not scavenging for scraps. "My dad's in prison for what he did to me. My mom." She stopped, her voice catching. "She's with her boyfriend. He pays the rent, so she lets him have me when he wants. I ran away 4 days ago." The words hit Richard like physical blows. He'd heard about children like Emma in news reports, read statistics in charity appeals. But seeing her here, real and damaged and fighting to survive, made those abstract numbers into living nightmare. "When did you last eat?" "Really eat?" Emma thought about it with the seriousness of an adult calculating taxes. "Tuesday, maybe. The school lunch lady gave me extra fries before I stopped going. It was Friday night." She'd been surviving on garbage for 3 days. Richard stood up so fast his vision blurred. He walked to his desk, picked up his phone, and called his driver. While he waited for Marcus to answer, he watched Emma carefully wrap up the moldy sandwich and tuck it into a plastic bag she pulled from her dress pocket. She was saving it. A piece of garbage food was precious enough to save. "Marcus, I need you to bring the car around. And stop at that all-night diner on 5th Street. Get some food. A lot of food. Kids' food. And Marcus? Hurry." He hung up and looked back at Emma, who was now standing by the closet like she might bolt. Her eyes darted between him and the door, calculating escape routes. "You're coming with me," he said. Emma shook her head violently. "I can't. If they find out I left, if he finds me," her voice cracked. "He said he'd kill me if I told anyone. He said no one would believe me anyway, because I'm just a lying little girl. If who finds you?" But Emma pressed her lips together, terror creeping back into her eyes. Richard saw the war happening behind those pale blue irises, the desperate want to trust warring with learned survival instincts. "Nobody's going to hurt you," he said, the words feeling strange in his mouth. He hadn't made a promise like that in 20 years. Not since. He pushed the thought away. His own childhood was a locked box he'd spent decades refusing to open. "I know you don't know me, Emma. I know you have no reason to trust me. But I need you to listen very carefully." He crouched down again, making himself smaller, less threatening. "I have never hurt a child. I will never hurt a child. And as long as you're with me, no one else will hurt you either." Emma studied his face with an intensity that was unnerving in someone so young. She was reading him, he realized, the way he read hostile takeover bids and contract negotiations. Looking for lies, for traps, for the inevitable betrayal that her short life had taught her to expect. "Why?" she asked finally. The question was simple, but the answer was complicated. Why did he care? Why was he willing to disrupt his carefully ordered life for a child he'd known for 10 minutes? He thought about his penthouse, cold and silent. He thought about his days, measured in profit margins and stock prices. He thought about the last time anyone had needed him for something that mattered. "Because," he said quietly, "everyone deserves to be safe. And you're not safe where you came from." Emma considered this. Then she asked, "What if they come looking for me? Then they'll have to go through me first." Something shifted in her expression. Not trust, not yet, but the possibility of trust. The beginning of hope that someone might actually mean what they said. "Come on, Emma. Let's get you some real food." The ride to Richard's penthouse was the longest 20 minutes of his life. Emma sat in the corner of the leather back seat, as far from him as possible, clutching a paper bag that contained a hamburger, fries, and a chocolate milkshake. She ate slowly, methodically, like someone who'd learned not to waste a single bite, but also like someone who expected the food to be taken away at any moment. Marcus, his driver of 10 years, kept glancing in the rearview mirror. Richard could see the questions in his eyes, the professional concern of someone who'd watched his boss operate with machine-like precision for a decade, never deviating from routine, never bringing personal complications into his world. "Mr. Hayes," Marcus said carefully, "should I ask any questions about this?" "No," Richard replied, his eyes on Emma. "But you might want to forget you saw anything tonight. At least until I figure out what comes next." Marcus nodded. He'd been with Richard long enough to understand that his boss sometimes operated in gray areas where the law was more suggestion than rule. This felt different, though. This felt personal. When they pulled up to the gleaming tower that housed Richard's penthouse, Emma finally spoke. "Are you going to call the police?" Richard looked at her, really looked at her. She was small for 7, all sharp angles and hollow cheeks. The hamburger had put some color back in her face, but her posture remained defensive, ready for flight or fight despite her size. "Do you want me to call the police?" Emma considered this with that same adult seriousness that kept catching him off guard. "They'll just send me back. They always send kids back. And then things get worse because you tried to get help." "Back where?" But Emma had retreated into that shell of silence again, her burger forgotten in her lap. Richard recognized the look. It was the same expression he'd worn as a 7-year-old in the Riverside group home, when social workers asked questions he'd learned not to answer. "Emma," he said gently, "I'm not going to send you anywhere you don't want to go. Not tonight. Maybe not ever." She looked at him with those 2 old eyes. "You can't promise that. Adults can't really promise anything." The matter-of-fact way she said it broke something inside Richard's chest. A 7-year-old shouldn't understand the limits of adult promises. A 7-year-old should still believe that grown-ups could fix anything. His penthouse occupied the entire top floor of the building. Floor-to-ceiling windows offered a view of the city that magazines called breathtaking. The furniture was modern, expensive, and had never been touched by anyone under 30. Everything was white or black or silver, a monument to successful isolation. Emma stood in the doorway, small and out of place, clutching her paper bag. "This is where you live?" she asked. "Yes." She walked slowly through the living room, her bare feet silent on the marble floor. She stopped in front of the massive window that faced east, where the city lights sparkled like scattered diamonds. Her reflection in the glass looked ghostly, insubstantial. "It's like a castle," she said quietly. "But empty." Richard had been told that before, by business partners and dates who were impressed by his wealth but unnerved by the sterile perfection of his home. But when Emma said it, it sounded different. It sounded like recognition, like she understood something about loneliness that most adults missed. "Are you tired?" he asked. Emma shook her head, but he could see the exhaustion in the way her shoulders sagged, in how she swayed slightly on her feet. Adrenaline had probably been keeping her upright for days. He led her to the guest bedroom, a space he'd never used because he never had guests. The room was sparse but clean, with a queen-size bed that could have fit 3 of her. Emma stood in the doorway, not moving. "This is your room," he said. "For tonight, anyway. There are clothes in the closet. They'll be too big, but they're clean." Emma stared at the bed like it might bite her. "It's too big," she whispered. Richard realized the room was probably larger than anywhere she'd ever slept safely. The bed was enormous, the ceilings high, the space designed for adult comfort rather than child security. "Would you prefer something smaller?" he asked. Emma nodded, not trusting her voice. Richard thought for a moment, then led her to his home office. It was smaller, cozier, with built-in bookshelves and a leather reading chair. He pulled some cushions from the couch and arranged them in the corner. "How's this?" Emma's eyes filled with tears. "It's perfect," she whispered. But when Richard started to leave, she spoke again. "Are you going to lock the door?" The question hit him like a physical blow. "No, Emma. I'm never going to lock you in anywhere. And I'm never going to let anyone else lock you up either." She nodded, but he could see she didn't quite believe him. Trust, he was learning, wasn't something you could just give to a child who'd been betrayed by every adult in her life. It had to be earned, piece by piece, day by day. "I'll be right across the hall," he said. "If you need anything at all, you just call for me, okay?" "Okay." Richard closed the door gently and stood in the hallway listening. He heard the soft rustle of cushions, then nothing. He waited 10 minutes before walking to his own room, but he didn't sleep. Instead, he sat by his window and stared out at the city, wondering what the hell he'd just committed himself to. At 3 in the morning, he heard crying. Not loud, dramatic sobs, but the quiet, careful crying of someone who'd learned that tears were dangerous. He found Emma curled up in the corner of the makeshift bed, as far from the door as possible, her small body shaking. "Hey," he said softly from the doorway. "What's wrong?" Emma wiped her eyes quickly, ashamed of the tears. "Nothing. I'm sorry. I'll be quiet." Richard's heart broke a little more. He sat on the floor near her corner, careful to keep his distance, careful not to loom over her. "Bad dream?" Emma nodded. "I dreamed about the basement. About what he did down there." "What basement?" Emma went quiet, that wall of silence sliding back into place. But then, in a voice so small he had to strain to hear it, she said, "That's where he took me. When my mom's boyfriend wanted to play his games. There's no windows down there. No one can hear you scream." Richard felt rage build in his chest, hot and pure and focused. He wanted to find the man who'd hurt her and introduce him to the kind of pain that lasted. But Emma was watching him, gauging his reaction, and he forced himself to stay calm. "That's never going to happen again," he said quietly. "How do you know?" "Because I won't let it." Emma studied his face in the dim light from the hallway. "You don't even know me. Why would you fight for me?" Richard didn't have a good answer for that. He wasn't sure why this child had cracked something open inside him, why her pain felt like his own pain. Maybe it was because he recognized something in her eyes, the same hollow look he'd worn as a boy, the same careful watchfulness of someone who'd learned too young that the world was dangerous. "When I was about your age," he said, "I lived in a place called Riverside Group Home. It was supposed to be safe, but some of the adults there forgot that children aren't things to be used. I used to lie awake at night, afraid to close my eyes, afraid of what might happen in the dark. Emma's eyes widened. What happened to you? Some of the same things that happened to you, I think. Different people, same damage. They sat in silence for a moment. Then Emma asked, did the nightmares stop? Richard thought about lying, about giving her false hope. Instead, he told the truth. Most of them. The worst ones anyway. But it took years. And I had to learn that not all adults are monsters. Some of them actually keep their promises. Emma nodded like this made sense to her. Can you stay? Just until I fall asleep? I'm scared he'll find me in my dreams. Richard had spent the last 20 years avoiding exactly this kind of connection. He'd built his life around the principle that needing people was weakness, that caring too much was a liability. But looking at Emma, small and broken and trying so hard to be brave, he couldn't remember why any of that had seemed important. Of course, he said. He stayed until her breathing deepened and her small fists unclenched. Even then, he didn't leave. He sat on the floor of his office and watched the sun rise over the city, wondering how a 7-year-old girl had managed to crack open something he'd kept locked away for decades. Morning brought new challenges. Emma woke up early, slipping out of her makeshift bed, so quietly he almost missed it. He found her in the kitchen, standing on a chair and washing the dishes from the night before with methodical precision. Emma, you don't have to do that. She looked over her shoulder, startled, nearly dropping the plate in her hands. I always do the dishes. If I don't do them right, they get angry. Who gets angry? But Emma was already climbing down from the chair, her face closed off again. Richard was beginning to recognize the pattern. Anytime he asked about the people in her life, she shut down completely. Are you hungry? He asked instead. Emma nodded, but when he opened the refrigerator, he realized he had nothing a 7-year-old would want to eat. His fridge contained leftover takeout from expensive restaurants, a bottle of champagne, and some wilted vegetables. His life wasn't set up for children. It wasn't set up for anyone but himself. How about pancakes? He suggested, though he had no idea how to make them. Emma's eyes lit up for the first time since he'd found her. Really? Really? Though I should warn you, I've never actually made pancakes before. Never. You'll have to help me figure it out. What followed was the most disastrous cooking attempt of Richard's life. He burned the first batch, undercooked the second, and somehow managed to get flour on every surface in the kitchen. But Emma laughed. Actually laughed, when he flipped a pancake so enthusiastically it stuck to the ceiling. You're really bad at this, she said, giggling. Terrible, he agreed. But we'll get better. The word "we" slipped out before he could stop it, and he saw Emma notice. Her smile faded slightly, replaced by something more cautious. How long can I stay? She asked. Richard paused, a spatula in his hand, pancake batter in his hair. It was a fair question, and he didn't have a good answer. He couldn't keep a child indefinitely without involving authorities. There were laws, procedures, systems designed to handle situations like this. But looking at Emma, finally relaxed, finally acting like the child she was, he couldn't bring himself to mention social services or foster care or any of the official channels that would inevitably fail her the way they'd failed him. Let's just worry about today, he said finally. Emma nodded, but he could see her building walls again, preparing for the inevitable disappointment. The pancakes suddenly tasted like cardboard in his mouth. After breakfast, Richard called his office and canceled his meetings for the day. His assistant Patricia had worked for him for 8 years and had never heard him cancel anything that wasn't life-threatening. Are you feeling all right, Mr. Hayes? She asked, concern evident in her voice. I'm fine. Just handle things for today. Reschedule everything. Everything? Including the Morrison account presentation. Everything. There was a pause. Sir, if you don't mind me asking, is there some kind of emergency? Richard looked at Emma, who was sitting cross-legged on his couch, staring out the window with that same careful watchfulness that never seemed to leave her. You could say that, he replied. He spent the morning watching Emma explore his penthouse with the careful movements of someone who'd learned not to touch things that didn't belong to her. She admired his books but didn't pull them from the shelves. She looked at his expensive art but kept her hands clasped behind her back. "You can touch things," he said. "It's okay." Emma shook her head. "I might break something. Then you'd have to send me away." The casual way she said it, like being sent away was as inevitable as weather, made Richard's chest tight. He knelt down in front of her. "Emma, I want you to listen to me very carefully. You are not going to break anything that matters. And even if you did, I wouldn't send you away. Do you understand?" Emma studied his face with those old soul eyes. "You don't know me yet," she said quietly. "People always change their minds when they know me. When they find out about the things that happened. The things I let happen. You didn't let anything happen, Emma. You were a little girl. You had no choice. That's not what they said. They said I was bad. That I made them do those things." Richard felt his hands clench into fists. The rage that had been simmering since last night threatened to boil over. Someone had convinced this child that she was responsible for her own abuse. Someone had taken a little girl and twisted her understanding of right and wrong until she blamed herself for the monsters in her life. "They lied," he said, his voice steady despite the fury coursing through him. "Everyone who told you that was lying. You were a child, Emma. Children don't make adults hurt them. Adults choose to hurt children, and that choice is theirs alone." Emma blinked, processing this information. "But if I was good, if I didn't cry or fight or try to run away, maybe they would have stopped." "No," Richard said firmly. "It wouldn't have mattered what you did. People who hurt children will find excuses no matter how the child behaves. You could have been perfect, and they still would have hurt you. Because the problem was never you, Emma. The problem was them." Emma's eyes filled with tears. "Really? Really?" Before Richard could respond further, his phone rang. Patricia's name flashed on the screen, and he almost ignored it. But something in Emma's posture, the way she'd gone suddenly rigid, made him answer. "I'm sorry to bother you, Mr. Hayes, but there's a woman here. She says she's looking for her daughter, Emma Collins. She seems agitated, and she's with a man who's making our security team nervous." Richard felt the blood drain from his face. He looked at Emma, who had gone completely still, her eyes wide with terror. "I'll be right there," he said. Emma was already backing toward the hallway. "She found me," she whispered. "She brought him with her." "Who's him?" But Emma was running. Richard caught up with her in the bathroom, where she was trying to lock herself in the shower. "Emma, stop. Talk to me. You have to hide me," she said, her voice desperate now. "Please." "She'll take me back to him. She always takes me back because he pays her. He pays her to let him hurt me." Richard pulled her into his arms, and Emma collapsed against him, shaking. He thought the worst was behind them, that finding Emma was the hard part. But he was wrong. The real battle was just beginning. "Listen to me," he said, his voice steady despite the rage building in his chest. "Nobody is taking you anywhere. Do you hear me? Nobody. But she's my mom," Emma sobbed. "The law says I have to go with her." Richard held her tighter. He thought about his own childhood, about the social workers who'd sent him back to bad situations because family was supposed to be sacred, about the system that protected parental rights over children's safety. "The law," he said quietly, "isn't always right. Sometimes you have to make your own law." "What does that mean?" Richard made a decision that would change both their lives forever. "It means I'm going to fight for you. Whatever it takes." Richard's office building had never felt like a war zone before, but that's exactly what it was now. He sat across from the woman who claimed to be Emma's mother, trying to reconcile the image in his head with the reality in front of him. Janet Collins was thin to the point of gauntness, with hollow cheeks and yellowed teeth that spoke of hard living and harder choices. Her blonde hair was the same shade as Emma's, but where Emma's eyes held depth despite their trauma, Janet's were flat and calculating. She wore tight jeans and a low-cut top that had seen better days, and she kept glancing at the man beside her for approval. The man who'd introduced himself as Ray was everything Richard had expected from Emma's terrified description. Tall and broad-shouldered, with cold eyes and hands that looked like they'd done damage. He sat with the casual confidence of someone who'd never faced real consequences for his actions. "Where is she?" Janet demanded, lighting her third cigarette since she'd sat down. "I know you have her. The cleaning lady told me everything." Richard kept his voice level. "I found a child in my office. A child who was hungry and scared and hiding in a supply closet. I did what any decent person would do." "You kidnapped her," Ray said, his voice carrying the kind of quiet menace that made Richard's security team shift uncomfortably by the door. "I fed her." Janet leaned forward, and Richard could smell alcohol on her breath at 10 in the morning. "She's my daughter. Mine. You have no right to keep her from me. Where have you been for the past week?" "That's none of your business." "It became my business when I found your 7-year-old daughter living like a feral animal in my office building." Janet's face hardened. Emma's always been dramatic, making up stories, trying to get attention. "I bet she told you all kinds of things, didn't she? About me, about Ray." Richard said nothing, but something in his expression made Janet smile, a cold, knowing smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Yeah, I thought so. Listen, rich boy, I know your type. You think you can play hero, save the poor little girl, feel good about yourself. But Emma belongs with family." "With me." "Family," Richard repeated. "Is that what you call selling your daughter to your boyfriend?" The words hung in the air like a challenge. Ray shifted in his chair, his eyes narrowing, but Janet just laughed. "I don't know what kind of lies she's been telling you, but Emma has an active imagination. Always has. She makes up stories because she doesn't like sharing my attention. She has rope burns on her ankles. She ties herself up. It's one of her weird habits. She has bruises in the shape of adult hands on her arms. She bruises easy, always running into things." Richard stared at this woman who could dismiss her daughter's obvious trauma with such casual indifference. He'd dealt with sociopaths in business, people who could lie without blinking, who saw other humans as tools to be used. But seeing that same coldness applied to a child, to Emma, made his blood run cold. "She told me about the basement," he said quietly. For the first time, Janet's composure cracked slightly. Ray's face went completely blank, which was somehow more terrifying than anger would have been. "I don't know what you're talking about," Janet said, but her voice was less steady now. "She told me about the games Ray likes to play. About how you let him take her downstairs where no one can hear her scream. About how you tell her it's her fault, that she's bad, that she deserves what happens to her." Ray stood up slowly, his massive frame casting a shadow across the conference table. "You need to be very careful what you say next," he said softly. Richard stood as well, grateful for the security team's presence. "Or what? You'll do to me what you've been doing to a 7-year-old girl." "I've never touched that kid." Emma says differently. "Emma's a liar," Janet snapped. "She's sick in the head. Makes up stories to get people to feel sorry for her. That's why no one else would take her when I needed help. No one else would take her because you told them she was a problem child. Because you made sure no one would want to help her. Because that kept her dependent on you, kept her trapped with you and him." Janet stubbed out her cigarette and stood. "I want my daughter. No. Or I call the police and tell them you kidnapped her." Richard had been expecting this moment since the phone call. He'd spent the morning preparing for it, making calls to lawyers and judges and anyone who might help. But standing here, facing the people who'd turned Emma's childhood into a nightmare, he realized that legal solutions might not be enough. "Call them," he said. Janet blinked. "What?" "Call the police. Let's see what they think about a mother who leaves her 7-year-old to fend for herself while she disappears for a week. Let's see what they think about the photographs I took of Emma's injuries. You can't prove anything. I have medical records from the doctor who examined her this morning. I have photographs of her injuries. I have her own testimony about what you've both done to her." He didn't mention that Emma had refused to speak to the doctor, had hidden in the bathroom until Richard convinced her that the examination was just to make sure she was healthy. The photographs were real, though, and the medical report would be damning if it ever saw the inside of a courtroom. "She's just a kid," Ray said. No one's going to believe her over us. Maybe. But are you willing to bet your freedom on it? Because Emma's not the only child you've hurt, is she, Ray? I had my people do some research. Jennifer Martinez, age 8. Ashley Thompson, age 6. Sarah Wilson, age 9. Should I keep going? Ray's face went white. Richard had been bluffing, but the man's reaction told him he'd hit close to the mark. I don't know what you're talking about, Ray said, but his voice lacked conviction now. The thing about men like you, Richard said quietly, is that you never stop with just one victim. You move from family to family, finding women desperate enough to trade their children's safety for rent money. Janet's not your first girlfriend with a young daughter, and Emma's not your first victim. Janet was looking between them now, confusion replacing anger on her face. What's he talking about, Ray? Ray ignored her, his focus entirely on Richard. What do you want? I want you to leave Emma alone. She's not yours to keep. She's not yours to hurt. They stared at each other across the conference table. Richard had negotiated hostile takeovers worth billions of dollars, but none of those deals had felt as important as this moment, this conversation that would determine Emma's future. How much? Janet asked suddenly. Excuse me, how much to make this go away? You're obviously loaded. Emma's been nothing but trouble since she was born. Always crying, always hungry, always needing something. I'll sign whatever papers you want, but it's going to cost you. Richard felt something die inside him, the last trace of faith he'd had in human decency. This woman was willing to sell her own child. Not give her up for Emma's safety, not surrender her because she couldn't care for her, but sell her like a commodity. 50,000, he said. Janet's eyes lit up. 100. 75. Final offer. Deal. The fact that she agreed so quickly told Richard everything he needed to know about Emma's worth in her mother's eyes. He called his lawyer immediately, had emergency custody papers drawn up within hours, and watched Janet Collins sign away her parental rights with the same enthusiasm she'd shown for her cigarettes. Ray was a different problem. He couldn't be bought off because he didn't legally exist in Emma's life. But as they prepared to leave, Richard made sure he understood the situation. If I ever see you near Emma again, Richard said quietly, if I even hear that you've been in the same city as her, I will make sure every law enforcement agency in the country knows exactly what you are. Do we understand each other? Ray stared at him for a long moment, then nodded once. When they were gone, when the money had been transferred and the documents filed, Richard sat alone in his conference room and tried to process what he'd just done. He'd bought a child's freedom, but the transaction left him feeling hollow. Emma was safe now, legally his, but at what cost? His phone buzzed with a text from his security team. Both subjects have left the building. Do you want us to maintain surveillance? Richard typed back, yes. I want to know where they go, who they talk to, everything they do. If they so much as look in Emma's direction, I want to know about it. He was taking no chances. Emma had been through enough. Emma was waiting for him when he got home, sitting by the window where he'd left her hours ago. She looked up when he entered, and he could see the fear in her eyes, the careful way she held herself, like she was prepared to run or fight or disappear entirely. Did she take me away? She asked quietly. Richard sat down beside her, close enough to offer comfort but far enough to give her space. No, Emma. She's gone. She's not coming back. Ever. Ever. Emma nodded slowly, processing this information with her usual serious consideration. What happens to me now? Richard had been dreading this question all day. The truth was, he still didn't entirely know. He'd acted on instinct, driven by a rage and protectiveness that had surprised him with its intensity. But now, in the quiet of his penthouse with a 7-year-old girl looking at him with cautious hope, he had to figure out what came next. Well, he said carefully, you could stay here. With me. If you wanted to. Emma's eyes widened. Forever. If that's what you want. Emma was quiet for a long time, staring out at the city lights below. When she finally spoke, her voice was so soft he almost missed it. Nobody's ever wanted to keep me before. The words hit Richard like a physical blow. He thought about his own childhood, about the group home where he'd learned that love was conditional and temporary. About the years he'd spent building walls to protect himself from exactly the kind of pain Emma carried. "Well," he said, his voice rougher than he intended, "I do." Emma looked at him then, really looked at him, and he saw something shift in her expression. Not trust, not yet, but the possibility of trust. The beginning of hope. "Can I really touch your books?" she asked. Richard laughed, surprising them both. "You can read every single one if you want. Even the big ones? Especially the big ones." That night, Emma fell asleep on the couch, curled up with a volume of fairy tales that was probably too advanced for her, but that she'd insisted on trying. Richard covered her with a blanket and sat in his chair, watching her sleep. He'd spent 35 years avoiding exactly this, the vulnerability that came with caring about someone else, the risk that came with opening your heart to another person's pain. But looking at Emma, small and finally peaceful in the lamplight, he couldn't remember why he'd thought isolation was safer. His phone buzzed with messages from his office, from business partners, from a world that demanded his constant attention. He turned it off and stayed where he was, keeping watch over a child who'd somehow managed to crack open his carefully constructed life and let the light in. The next few weeks passed in a blur of legal paperwork and careful adjustment. Richard hired a team of lawyers to expedite the adoption process, called in favors from judges and social workers, and threw money at every obstacle that appeared. Money, it turned out, could solve most problems, but not all of them. Emma's nightmares came every few nights, vivid terrors that left her shaking and unable to go back to sleep. She hoarded food in her room despite his assurances that meals would always be available. She flinched when he moved too quickly, and she still asked permission for everything, to use the bathroom, to get a glass of water, to exist in spaces without being a burden. But slowly, carefully, there were signs of healing. Emma discovered his library and worked her way through books with a hunger that reminded Richard of his own childhood need to escape into other worlds. She drew pictures that gradually covered his refrigerator, filling the sterile spaces of his penthouse with color and life. She laughed, not often, but when she did, it was like sunlight breaking through storm clouds. The real test came 3 weeks after Janet Collins had signed the papers. Richard was in his home office, reviewing contracts, when he heard a crash from the living room. He ran out to find Emma standing over the broken pieces of a crystal vase, her face white with terror. "I'm sorry," she whispered, backing away from the mess. I'm sorry. Please don't send me away. I'll clean it up. I'll pay for it somehow. I'll be good. I promise I'll be good." Her voice was rising, panic setting in, and Richard could see her retreating into that place where she'd learned to survive, small, apologetic, desperate to avoid punishment. Richard knelt down and started picking up the larger pieces of crystal. "Emma, it's okay. It's just a vase. But it's expensive," she said, tears streaming down her face. "Everything here is expensive, and I broke it, and now you'll send me away because I'm nothing but trouble and I ruin everything I touch and—" "Emma." Richard's voice was firm but gentle. "Look at me." She looked, her whole body trembling, eyes wide with the kind of terror that came from too many broken promises and too much abandonment. "It's a thing," he said. "Just a thing. You are more important than everything in this apartment combined. Do you understand me?" Emma shook her head. "But my mom said—" She stopped, clapping a hand over her mouth like she'd revealed a dangerous secret. "What did she say?" Emma's silence stretched between them, heavy with old pain and learned shame. "Emma," Richard said softly, setting down the crystal pieces and giving her his full attention, "you can tell me anything. I promise I won't get angry," she said. Emma's voice was barely a whisper. "She said I broke everything I touched. That's why nobody could love me. That's why my dad went away. That's why bad things happened. Because I ruin everything." Richard felt rage building in his chest again, hot and pure and focused on the woman who'd convinced a child that she was responsible for every tragedy in her young life. But Emma was watching him, reading his face for signs of rejection or anger, so he kept his voice calm. "Your mother was wrong," he said quietly. "About everything. You didn't break your family, Emma. The adults around you failed, but that was never your fault. How do you know?" Because I was a kid like you once. I thought everything bad that happened was because of something I did or didn't do. It took me 30 years to figure out that some adults are just broken, and they break the children around them too. Emma pulled back to look at him, studying his face with that intensity that always caught him off guard. Were you broken? Richard considered the question seriously. I was. For a long time. But you know what I learned? What? Broken things can be fixed. It just takes time. And the right person to help. Emma nodded like this made sense to her. Then she asked, Are you helping fix me? We're helping fix each other, Richard said. He meant it. Emma had cracked something open inside him that he'd thought was permanently sealed. The careful walls he'd built around his heart were crumbling, and instead of feeling vulnerable, he felt more alive than he had in decades. They spent the rest of the evening cleaning up the crystal together, and Richard made a point of letting Emma help dispose of the pieces. He wanted her to see that broken things could be cleaned up, dealt with, moved past. That accidents didn't have to mean abandonment. The next morning brought a phone call that changed everything again. Richard was making breakfast. He'd gotten better at pancakes over the past few weeks, when his private line rang. Only a handful of people had that number, and most of them wouldn't call this early unless something was wrong. Mr. Hayes. The voice was unfamiliar, professional. This is Detective Sarah Martinez with the NYPD. I'm calling about Emma Collins. Richard felt his blood turn to ice. Emma looked up from her cereal, sensing the shift in his energy. What about her? He asked, trying to keep his voice neutral. We've been investigating reports of child abuse connected to Janet Collins and her boyfriend Ray Henderson. Emma's name came up in our investigation. We'd like to speak with her. Richard's first instinct was to refuse, to protect Emma from having to relive her trauma. But then he thought about what she'd told him, about other children, about Ray moving from family to family, finding new victims. Can you give me more details? He asked. We've had reports from 3 other families. Similar pattern. Single mothers, young daughters, boyfriends who pay the bills in exchange for access to the children. Emma's case is the most recent, but we think there may be others. Richard looked at Emma, who was watching him with growing concern. Detective Martinez, he said carefully, Emma has been through significant trauma. Any interview would have to be handled very carefully. Of course, we have specialists who work with child victims. But Mr. Hayes, Emma's testimony could be crucial in putting these people away. Not just for what they did to her, but for what they've done to other children. After the call ended, Richard sat at the kitchen table with Emma and explained the situation as gently as he could. She listened with that same serious attention she gave everything, her small face growing more thoughtful as he spoke. They want me to tell them about the basement, she said finally. Yes, but only if you want to. Only if you feel strong enough. Emma was quiet for a long time, stirring her cereal around in the bowl. Will it help other kids? She asked. It might. Kids like me. Yes. Emma nodded slowly. Then I'll do it. But... She looked up at him with those 2 old eyes. Will you be there? Every second, Richard promised. The interview was scheduled for the following week, giving Emma time to prepare with a child psychologist Richard hired specifically for the purpose. Dr. Sarah Chen was gentle but thorough, helping Emma understand what would be asked of her and how to handle the difficult emotions that would come up. The important thing to remember, Dr. Chen told Emma during one of their sessions, is that telling the truth isn't the same as tattling. When adults hurt children, other adults need to know so they can protect more children. Emma absorbed this information with her usual seriousness. She'd been drawing more lately. Richard noticed violent, angry pictures that Dr. Chen said were a healthy way for her to process trauma. The drawings showed dark basements and faceless monsters, but they also showed a small girl fighting back, refusing to disappear. The night before the interview, Emma couldn't sleep. Richard found her in the living room at midnight, sitting by the window and staring out at the city. Scared? He asked, settling beside her. A little, she admitted. What if they don't believe me? They'll believe you. What if I forget something important? You just tell them what you remember. That's all anyone can ask. Emma leaned against him, and he wrapped an arm around her small shoulders. She was getting taller, he realized, filling out a little. The hollow look was slowly leaving her cheeks. "Richard," she said softly. "Yeah. After tomorrow, after I tell them everything, will it be over? Will I be safe?" Richard wished he could promise her that. Wished he could guarantee that telling her story would put the monsters away forever, that she'd never have to be afraid again. But he'd learned long ago that the world didn't offer those kinds of guarantees. "I can't promise it will be over," he said honestly. "But I can promise that you're safe. Whatever happens, wherever we go from here, you're safe with me." Emma nodded and closed her eyes, trusting him to keep watch while she rested. And Richard did keep watch, sitting by the window until dawn, protecting the sleep of a child who'd finally found a place where nightmares couldn't reach her. The police station was nothing like the sterile offices where Richard usually conducted business. It smelled of coffee and disinfectant, and the fluorescent lights cast everything in a harsh, unflattering glow. Emma walked close to Richard's side, her hand tucked firmly in his, as Detective Martinez led them to a small room designed specifically for interviewing children. The room was softer than the rest of the station. Comfortable chairs, warm lighting, a box of tissues on every surface. But Emma still tensed when the door closed behind them. "It's okay," Richard murmured. "I'm right here." Detective Martinez was a woman in her 40s with kind eyes and a gentle voice. She'd worked with traumatized children before, Richard could tell, because she moved slowly and spoke softly, giving Emma time to adjust to the situation. "Emma," she said, "I want you to know that you're very brave for being here. What you're going to tell me today might help other children who are in situations like the one you were in." Emma nodded, her grip on Richard's hand tightening. What followed was the most difficult hour of Richard's life. Emma, speaking in a voice barely above a whisper, told Detective Martinez about the basement. About the games Ray liked to play. About how her mother would leave her alone with him for hours, sometimes days. About the threats, the bribes, the careful way they'd convinced her that everything was her fault. Richard felt sick listening to the details, but he forced himself to stay calm for Emma's sake. She needed him to be strong, to be her anchor in a world that had taught her that adults couldn't be trusted. "Emma," Detective Martinez said gently, "I know this is hard, but I need to ask you about other children. Did you ever see Ray with other little girls?" Emma's eyes darted to Richard, seeking permission or reassurance. He nodded encouragingly. "Sometimes," Emma said quietly. "When we lived in the apartment before, there was a girl named Lily. She was 6. Her mom worked at night, and Ray would babysit her. She cried a lot. Do you remember Lily's last name?" Emma shook her head. "But she had red hair, and a birthmark on her arm that looked like a butterfly." Detective Martinez made notes, her expression growing grimmer with each detail. "Were there others?" "Maybe. Ray always had friends who had kids. He liked to volunteer to watch them when their moms went out." The interview continued for another 30 minutes, Emma's soft voice filling in pieces of a puzzle that painted a picture of systematic abuse spanning years and multiple victims. When it was finally over, Detective Martinez looked at Emma with genuine admiration. "You did great, Emma. Really great. What you told me today is going to help a lot of people." Emma nodded, exhausted but proud. As they prepared to leave, Detective Martinez pulled Richard aside. "We've got enough to arrest both of them," she said quietly. "Emma's testimony, combined with what we've heard from other witnesses, should be more than sufficient for conviction. But I have to warn you, the defense will probably try to discredit her. They'll say she's too young, too traumatized, that her memory isn't reliable." "What does that mean for Emma?" "It means she might have to testify in court, which means she'll have to see them again." Richard felt his stomach drop. The thought of Emma having to face her abusers in a courtroom, having to relive her trauma in front of strangers, made him feel sick. Is there any way around that? Possibly. If we can get them to plead guilty, there won't be a trial. But men like Ray Henderson don't usually go quietly. That night, Richard called his lawyer and arranged for the best criminal defense attorney in the city to represent Emma's interests. He also hired a private security firm to watch the penthouse, to make sure Janet and Ray couldn't get anywhere near Emma while they awaited trial. Emma seemed lighter after the interview, as if telling her story had lifted some weight from her shoulders. She slept better that night than she had in weeks, and when she woke up, she asked if she could call Detective Martinez to see if they'd caught the bad people yet. "It doesn't work that fast," Richard explained. "But Detective Martinez promised to call us as soon as anything happens." The call came 2 days later. Both Janet Collins and Ray Henderson had been arrested. Ray was being held without bail due to flight risk and the severity of the charges. Janet had been released on bond, but she was prohibited from contacting Emma or coming anywhere near their building. "It's really over?" Emma asked when Richard hung up the phone. "This part is," he said. "But, Emma, there might be a trial. Which means you might have to tell your story again, in front of more people." Emma considered this with her usual seriousness. "Will you be there?" "I'll be right beside you." "Then I can do it." Her simple confidence took Richard's breath away. This child who'd been broken by the adults who should have protected her was now ready to face those same adults in court, not for revenge, but to protect other children from sharing her fate. The trial was scheduled for 6 months later, giving the prosecutors time to build their case and giving Emma time to continue healing. During those months, Richard watched Emma slowly come back to life. She started attending a private school, where teachers praised her intelligence and gentle nature. She made friends, tentatively at first, but with growing confidence. She laughed more, cried less, and began to fill out the clothes Richard bought her. Most importantly, she began to trust. Not just Richard, but the world around her. She stopped hoarding food, stopped asking permission to breathe, stopped preparing for abandonment at every turn. One evening, about 4 months after her interview with Detective Martinez, Emma came to Richard's office where he was working late. "Can I ask you something?" she said. "Always." "Why did you save me?" Richard set down his pen and looked at her, really looked at her. The hollow-eyed child he'd found in his supply closet was gone, replaced by a little girl with bright eyes and a quick smile, a girl who was finally beginning to believe she deserved to take up space in the world. "I didn't save you, Emma," he said quietly. "You saved yourself. I just gave you a safe place to do it." Emma shook her head. "You saved me first. In the closet, when you could have called security and had me taken away. You chose to help me instead." Richard thought about that night, about the moment when he'd looked into Emma's eyes and seen something that cracked his heart open. "I guess I recognize something in you," he said. "Something that reminded me of myself when I was your age." "What?" "The need to be seen. To matter to someone. To be worth saving." Emma nodded like this made perfect sense to her. Then she asked, "Do you think my mom and Ray will go to prison?" "I think so. Detective Martinez says the evidence is very strong." "Good," Emma said with a fierceness that surprised him. "They hurt me, but they hurt other kids too. They should be stopped." The trial, when it finally came, was as difficult as Richard had feared. Emma had to take the stand and tell her story again, this time in front of a jury and with Janet and Ray sitting just feet away from her. But she did it with a courage that left the courtroom silent. Ray's defense attorney tried to discredit her, suggesting she was confused, that her memories were unreliable, that she'd been coached by Richard to tell lies. But Emma answered every question with quiet dignity, never wavering from her truth. "The defendant hurt me," she said simply when asked to describe what Ray had done to her. "He hurt me in the basement where no one could hear me cry. And he told me it was my fault, that I was bad, that no one would ever believe me if I told. But he was wrong. People did believe me. And now he can't hurt any more children." The jury deliberated for less than 2 hours. Ray Henderson was convicted on all counts and sentenced to 25 years in prison. Janet Collins pleaded guilty to child endangerment and received 5 years, with the possibility of parole in 3. When the verdicts were read, Emma squeezed Richard's hand and whispered, "It's really over now." "Yes," he said. "It's really over." But it wasn't an ending. It was a beginning. Epilogue. 5 years later, Richard Hayes stood in the main hall of the Emma Collins Foundation for Children in Crisis, watching his daughter, now 12 and radiant with health and confidence, address a room full of social workers, law enforcement officers, and child advocates. 5 years ago, Emma said, her voice clear and strong, I was a little girl who thought she didn't matter. I thought the bad things that happened to me were my fault, that I deserved to be hurt, that no one would ever want to keep me. Richard felt his throat tighten, the way it always did when Emma talked about those early days. She'd grown into a remarkable young woman, intelligent, compassionate, and determined to use her experience to help other children. But I was wrong, Emma continued. I did matter. I didn't deserve to be hurt. And someone did want to keep me. My dad taught me that family isn't about blood. It's about choice. It's about showing up day after day, until broken things start to heal. The foundation had grown from Richard's initial donation into a national organization, providing support for child victims of abuse and training for the professionals who worked with them. Emma had insisted on being involved from the beginning, despite Richard's concerns about her privacy and safety. These kids need to see that survival is possible, she'd argued when she was 9. They need to know that someone who went through what they're going through can grow up to be okay. Now, at 12, she spoke at conferences and fundraisers, always with Richard's support but increasingly in her own voice. She had written a book about her experience, The Girl in the Closet, with all proceeds going to the foundation. She had testified before Congress about the need for better protection for child victims. She'd become a voice for children who couldn't yet speak for themselves. But more than any of that, she'd simply grown up to be Emma. Funny, kind, wickedly smart, and absolutely fearless when it came to protecting other children. After her speech, as the crowd dispersed and Richard waited for Emma to finish talking with the social workers who'd surrounded her, Detective Martinez approached him. She's something special, the detective said, watching Emma patiently answer questions from a young caseworker who looked barely older than Emma herself. She always was, Richard replied. I just helped her remember that. You know, Ray Henderson died in prison last year. Inmates don't look kindly on child abusers. Richard felt nothing at the news. Ray Henderson had been a monster, but he'd been removed from the world years ago. What mattered now was the work Emma was doing to make sure other monsters couldn't hurt other children. Emma doesn't need to know that, he said. Detective Martinez nodded. Janet Collins got out 6 months ago. Clean record so far, but we're keeping an eye on her. This was news Richard hadn't heard, and he felt a familiar protective instinct kick in. Is Emma in any danger? I don't think so. Collins has stayed away from the city. Seems to be trying to rebuild her life somewhere else. But I thought you should know. That evening, over dinner in their penthouse, which Emma had long ago transformed from a sterile showcase into a warm home, Richard told Emma about Janet's release. How do you feel about that? He asked, watching her face carefully for signs of distress. Emma considered the question seriously, the way she always did. I hope she's learned something, she said finally. I hope she's figured out that children aren't things to be sold or traded or used. But mostly, I just hope she stays away from kids. And if she doesn't, Emma's expression hardened with a resolve that reminded Richard of himself. Then I'll make sure everyone knows exactly what kind of person she is. I'm not a scared little girl anymore, Dad. I'm not powerless. She wasn't. Somewhere along the way, the frightened child Richard had found in his supply closet had grown into a fierce young woman who refused to be silenced or diminished. She was everything he'd hoped she could become and more than he'd ever dared to imagine. That night, as Richard sat in his office reviewing foundation business, Emma knocked on his door. Dad? Can I ask you something? Always. She settled into the chair across from his desk, a position she'd claimed years ago when she'd first started helping him with foundation work. Do you ever regret it? Finding me, I mean. Taking me home. Changing your whole life. Richard set down his pen and looked at his daughter, brilliant, beautiful, brave Emma, who'd somehow managed to heal not just herself but him as well. Emma, he said quietly, finding you was the best thing that ever happened to me. You didn't change my life. You gave me one. Emma smiled, the real smile that lit up her whole face, the one that had taken months to appear and years to become natural. I love you too, Dad. I know, he said. I've always known. Outside, the city sparkled in the darkness, full of children who needed saving and adults who'd forgotten how to see them. But inside their home, Richard Hayes, former bachelor, current father, permanent advocate for the forgotten and the lost, helped his remarkable daughter with her homework and marveled at how completely love could transform a life. He'd spent 35 years learning how to be successful. It had taken a 7-year-old girl hiding in a closet to teach him how to be human, and every day since then had been a gift. The end. If you enjoyed the story, please like, comment, and subscribe to my channel. Your support is everything for me.